Hello Greenstylers, Cynthia here, and today I have a sewing tutorial for the Paseo skirt. Paseo was originally inspired by a sporty golf skirt that included undershorts for holding golf balls, but it quickly evolved to have multiple hem options including a lovely flounce and multiple lengths that make Paseo versatile enough to wear to your sports activities as well as work. Join me as I sew up both pocket options and the flounce as well as the curved faced hem option. For piece K1, the front main, there are lots of cut lines, so pay attention to your options. You have a straight skirt option or a pencil skirt option. Cut the hashed or dotted line for the pencil skirt option. For the pencil skirt only, you can choose the flounce option, which is the shortest cut line. There's also a shorter length skirt and a longer length skirt. I've cut the longer length. The other two hem options are the curved and faced hem option, shown here. There's also a straight hem option that you can choose. If making the front pocket option, cut the solid pocket cut line along the top. For piece K2, the back main, you will have just about the same options. You can choose the straight skirt, which is shown, or cut the inner line for the pencil skirt. Again, if you're doing the pencil skirt, you can choose the flounce cut line. And you can choose the longer or shorter lengths to match your front. Make sure to choose the same hem option that you chose for the front as well. Copy the dart markings from your pattern pieces, and if you're doing the optional welt pocket, mark the corners of that welt pocket. Cut 4 of piece C1, the front back waistband. You'll cut 2 of the main fabric and 2 of the lining fabric. You can choose between a high-rise or a mid-rise. For the optional front pocket, you'll need 2 of piece K3 and 2 of piece K4. Be sure to cut on the straight skirt cut line or pencil skirt cut line depending on your skirt choice. For the optional back welt pocket, cut 2 of piece P1, the welt pocket piece. Copy all markings from your pattern piece, and not shown is piece P3, the interfacing piece, cut 2 of those. You'll also need 2 of piece P2, the welt pocket lining. If making the curved hem, you'll need to cut hem facings, pieces K5 and K6. Make sure to copy the notches from your pattern pieces. Also note that there are different pieces for the straight skirt and the pencil skirt. And if making the pencil skirt, you'll need to make sure you cut on either the shorter cut line or longer skirt cut line. If making the flounce option, you'll need to cut 1 of piece K7 and 1 of piece K8, the front and back flounce pieces. We'll begin with the darts. I like to snip the edges of my darts so I can more easily see where the ends are. You're going to fold right along the dart with your fabric right sides facing together. So right now you see the wrong sides of my fabric. Pin along the dart. Starting at the edge of the fabric, use a straight stitch to stitch along the length of the dart. Take your time, stitch slowly and carefully. And here are some tips to avoid the dreaded pucker at the tip of your dart. At about 3/8 of an inch away from the point of the dart, change your stitch length to 1.0 millimeters. At this point, you'll angle your stitch so that you reach the fold about halfway before the tip of the dart. So yes, your stitches will depart from your markings at this point. Finish the final few stitches along the fold as close to the fold as possible. I'm talking just a few threads of fabric in between your stitches and the fold until you reach the point of the dart. At the point of the dart, stitch off of the fabric without back stitching. Leave your thread tails long and double knot in order to secure your stitches. Being careful not to pull too hard on those knots because you don't want to pucker the fabric at the point of your dart. Now press the darts towards the center and use a pressing hem if you have it, but if you don't, a rolled up piece of fabric works in a pinch. Place the welt interfacing P3 onto the wrong side of the back piece centered on the welt marks and press into place. You won't see the interfacing on my tutorial because I accidentally skipped this step, but do not make the mistake that I did. This interfacing will help you stitch the pockets tremendously. Now flip the back piece so that right side is facing up, and here are our beautiful darts. Make sure that the corners of that pocket are marked on your back piece, and make sure that you have copied all of the markings from your pattern piece onto the pocket P1. Now with right sides together, place the welt pocket onto the skirt back, lining up the rectangle welt marks. It's okay that your pocket piece won't perfectly line up with the top of the skirt at this point. What you need to make sure of is that you line up the rectangle markings. Pin into place and stitch around the rectangle carefully. We'll be using a straight stitch on our sewing machine for these steps. Now we'll cut along these lines that we've drawn on the center of the pocket marking. Cut through both layers along that center line and also along the 45-degree lines at either end. Clip as close to the corner as possible without clipping through the stitching. Push the welt pocket piece through the opening to the wrong side. Smooth out and press well. If the corners are not neat, turn it back and check to make sure you clip to the corner as close as possible. Once pressed well, fold the pocket up to cover the opening with the folded edge, just to the top of the welt opening. Press well again, and then we're going to baste the fold in place. We're only basting the pocket piece. We're not basting through the front of the skirt, piece K2. Top stitch around the outer rectangle of the pocket. Be careful to not stitch on that folded bit that you just folded up because that's the opening of the pocket. Place the welt pocket lining P2 onto the pocket with right sides together. Pin or clip the two pocket pieces together along the two sides in the bottom. If you find that P2 is a little bit longer and you have some excess sticking out the top, that's okay. We can trim that off at a later step. Fold the skirt back out of the way and stitch the pocket lining to the pocket using a straight stitch on your sewing machine. Again, making sure we're only stitching the two pocket pieces together and that we're not stitching the skirt piece. At this point, you can finish the edges using a serger or a zigzag stitch. We'll now baste the pocket to the top edge of the skirt using a long basting stitch on our sewing machine. And if you have remembered to add the interfacing to your pocket pieces, your top stitching will look much nicer than mine. At this point, you can trim off that excess fabric that may be sticking out the top. Begin the optional front pockets by placing the outer pocket K4 onto the front K1 with right sides together and aligning at the slanted top edge. Pin or clip in place and stitch with a straight stitch, stopping 1/2 inch from the center edges. Carefully clip the front from where you stopped sewing and clipping down 3/8 of an inch into the fabric. Carefully press the pocket up to create a nice crisp edge, and at this point you can understitch the pocket to the seam allowance, which I will show you in just a moment. By stitching right along this edge, you will be stitching the pocket to the seam allowance right along here. Or if you prefer to top stitch, you can fold the pocket all the way toward the back and top stitch along the front edge of the skirt right at the edge of that pocket opening right here. I'm doing the understitch step right at this moment. As you can see, I am stitching over the pocket piece and through the seam allowance. Here's how it will look when you're finished. Press the pockets once again, this time all the way towards the back. Right now we have the wrong side of the front skirt facing up and the right side of the pocket facing up. With right sides together, place the inner pockets, K3, onto the outer pockets, K4, matching up the curved edges. Pin the pockets together along the curve. Stitch using a stretch stitch or serger and a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Do not stitch through the front skirt piece K1. Fold the pockets toward the back side of the skirt and press flat once again. Pin and baste the outer edges of the pocket to the front K1 and also baste across the top edge where you clipped the front K1. Place the front onto the back with right sides together and pin or clip the side seams in place. Use a stretch stitch or serger and a 3/8 inch seam allowance. If making the curved hem, you'll stop where the curve begins, as indicated by the red arrow on the right-hand side of the screen, and where I'm pointing on the left-hand side of the screen. Place the front back waistband, pieces C1, right sides together, and pin along the short edges. Repeat for the remaining 2 waistband pieces, which will be the lining. Stitch using a straight stitch and a 3/8 inch seam allowance. We recommend a straight stitch because it makes ironing the seam allowance opening even easier, but of course you are welcome to use a stretch stitch here or your serger as well. Press the seam allowances open or to the back and then turn one waistband right sides out. Place that waistband inside the other one so that they are right sides together. Align and pin or clip along the top edge. Stitch with a stretch stitch or serger and a 3/8 inch seam allowance. If desired, you can sew a 1/4 inch elastic onto the seam allowance around the top edge before turning it right sides out. If you do, just make sure that the elastic is stitched to the main fabric side of the seam allowance. Another option is to understitch the seam allowance to the inner waistband. So here I'm pressing the seam allowance toward the inner waistband and we'll stitch just to the right hand side of that seam to stitch the seam allowance to the inside waistband. Turn the waistband right sides out and give it a press. And here's how it will look from the outside with the understitching. And then from the inside, you'll see the seam pressed toward the inside and the understitching on the inside of your waistband. And here are a couple of steps you may want to do before attaching the waistband. I went ahead and pinned the pockets down just to keep them out of the way so they don't accidentally fall and get in the way as I'm stitching. Another option would be to align and baste the bottom edges of the waistband. And finally, I marked the center front and center back of both the waistband and the skirt. Now we'll flip the waistband onto the skirt so that right sides are together and pin or clip all along the top edge of the skirt and the bottom edge of the waistband. Stitch with a stretch stitch or serger and a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Make sure you've transferred the markings from your pattern pieces onto the hem facing pieces and lay the front and back hem facing pieces together with right sides touching. Pin on the sides at the top edge only as shown. Stitch using a straight stitch and a 3/8 inch seam allowance from the top edge just down to the marking. It will be a very small stitch. Repeat for the other side and then press both seams open so that they'll look like this. Neaten the top edge with a serger or a zigzag stitch, ensuring that the seam you just pressed stays open as you stitch. With right sides together, pin the hem facing to the bottom of the skirt, making sure to align the side seams and making sure also to align the front hem facing with the front skirt and the back hem facing with the back skirt. I marked the centers front and back of the hem facings and the skirt to help me in aligning. And here's a close-up of what my side seams look like. Remember that this bit right here is folded back, and on the inside of the skirt pieces, it's folded back as well. So they should be folded back the same amount and carefully pinned together right at that spot. And when we're stitching, we'll be using a 3/8 inch seam allowance, but when we come to the top of that side seam, you'll see that we come off of a 3/8 inch seam allowance. It will get smaller as we get toward that point, and I'll give you a close-up of what that looks like as well. And note that this is a straight stitch on the sewing machine. And as we arrive to that side seam, we'll be creating an inverted V point. So you'll aim your stitches toward the seam of your facing just above where the opening of the facing is. Once you get to that seam, you'll leave your needle down and turn your fabric so that your V point is nice and sharp, and then you'll start stitching down the other side. You'll notice that your seam allowance shrinks as you head closer toward that point, but then by the time you get back to the bottom, your seam allowance will be back at the 3/8 of an inch size. And here's how it looks at this point. The next step is to clip the curved edges. You may notice, like I did, that these folded bits here between the facing and the main skirt fabric got a little bit bulky with all of that folded fabric in that one tiny little spot. I recommend snipping those folds open and then trimming the seam allowance before folding your facing toward the back. Just be careful to not trim too closely to those stitches, and definitely don't trim through any of the stitches. But once you've done this, you should find it much more easy to fold back and press that seam. It's going to be much less bulky. Now turn the entire facing toward the wrong side of the skirt and pin in place. Now top stitch along the upper edge of the facing. Use your fingers to keep track of where that edge is. Use a cover stitch or a stretch stitch, or if you're like me and you feel like you can get away with it, use a lengthened straight stitch here. The straight stitch is more likely to work if you're using the straight skirt, which has more room. As long as you won't need to stretch that hem while you're putting it on or when you're wearing it, then that would work fine. Now give it a good press and you are done. Place the front and back flounce pieces together with right sides together and aligning the short ends. Pin or clip in place. Stitch with a straight stitch on your sewing machine or a serger in a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Then press the seam allowance open or toward the back if you used a serger. Now we will slip the flounce onto the skirt, aligning the bottom edge of the skirt and the top edge of the flounce, and with right sides together. Again, I marked the center points on the flounce and on the bottom of the skirt. And make sure that you're aligning the front flounce piece with the front skirt and the back flounce with the back skirt. Stitch in place using a stretch stitch or serger in a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Optionally, you can hem the bottom edge of the flounce with a narrow rolled hem or turn it over 1/4 inch in hem. I'll leave mine raw, and so I'll take those thread tails from my serger stitch and just thread them using a large-eyed needle back into the seam allowance, and then I'll use a small zigzag stitch on my sewing machine to secure them in place. And with that, you are done. Congratulations on completing your Paseo skirt. We can't wait to see your versions. Please be sure to share across social media using hashtag GSPaseoSkirt. We'll be looking for you. Until next time, happy sewing from all of us at Greenstyle.